Ever since the first Jurassic Park film released, people have been obsessed with dinosaurs. And yet, the world sorely lacks dinosaur horror movies, games, shows, and books. Let's face it, giant reptiles are scary. But what if some of them survived to this very day? Well, these unlucky folks claim to have encountered dinosaurs in modern times. Like this video and comment your favorite dinosaur below. Utah Raptor Bros, where you at? Also, send me your scary Grand Canyon stories at darkstories.org and follow my podcasts on eeriecast.com. If you have an iPhone, would you mind leaving an honest review of my show, Freaky Folklore, hosted by Carmen Carrion on iTunes? Thank you. Now, let's begin. Caught in a Tempest. From Anonymous. We had no idea the rain would be coming down this heavily. My wife and I decided to leave well close to midnight on our way to visit family in Texas. We'd made the trip a number of times before over the years, but had never had quite this level of panic. Where Arkansas ends and Texas begins, you start to see fewer mountains and more flatlands in certain places. While I prefer the scenic vistas of Arkansas, the vast fields and clear-cut forests in northern Texas can be a breath of fresh air, but I doubt I'll ever be able to look at them the same way again. I can't recall exactly which town we were passing through when the rain started, but I do know the fields of wheat on either side, interspersed with juts of thick forest, were swaying in the wind as if rejoicing in the much-needed downpour. No problem, I thought. Driving through the rain at night ain't so bad. I even found it peaceful. Our panic arose when the rain's volume increased more by the second, until the torrent washed over the windshield to such an extent the wiper blades could not keep up. Soon, they were useless. Visibility became near zero. I slowed to a meager 5 miles per hour until we saw some reflections. My headlights caught on the artificial exterior of some old abandoned building. Carefully, I drove under the rusted awning in front of the derelict place. As my car passed under the metal shelter, my vision was restored. I turned off the headlights. Finally, then, I gasped at the sight of the storm around me. It was a supercell storm. The ditches parallel to the road had become flowing rivers. Lightning arced down every other second, touching treetops. Thunder crackled so near, so loud, my skin crawled at the instinctive terror of it all. It was apparent then to the both of us, we were captive to the storm. All we could do was wait under that ramshackle structure, hoping the flood didn't rise enough to sweep us away, or that the wind didn't violently tear down our rusted, precarious protection. Pretending we were more in awe than fear, my wife and I discussed the storm. Whoa, you ever seen one like this? I asked her, rubbing the sweat from my cheek with my palm. Absolutely not, much less been caught in one like this. She visibly flinched as another bolt of lightning rocked both the earth and sky. We turned on the car's entertainment system. No radio frequencies were coming through clear whatsoever. Luckily, I had downloaded a few conspiracy and historical podcasts to my phone, and the Bluetooth worked perfectly. We passed the time listening to the history of the Italian mafia. Then we learned about the effects of lead in the American water systems in the 20th century, all while staring out at the storm, never once thinking the rising floods and explosive lightning could be the least of our concerns. All at once, the rain, thunder, and lightning stopped. The sky remained apocalyptically dark, but the once turbulent clouds above had seemingly frozen in time. The chaos came to such an abrupt end that I'd forgotten to breathe. My eyelids retreated so forcefully, I swear they could have ripped. Even my heart slowed. The immense fear had been replaced with confusion. "What's happening?" My wife's sudden inquisition jolted me back to life. I breathed in deeply and blinked half a dozen times. "I don't know. Maybe it's over," I replied. She narrowed her eyes. "Something doesn't feel right. Honey, maybe we should leave." Even before her suggestion, my hands gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles had turned a ghostly white. Though my body begged me to drive away, I could not will myself to press down on the accelerator. "Are you listening? We need to..." She stopped mid-sentence, a sharp gasp escaping her throat as she covered her mouth with both hands. I dreaded how quickly my eyes traced her gaze. It wasn't but a moment before I had locked eyes on it too. A massive shadow stood on the road in front of us, next to the ruinous building. It stood about 20 feet high. At first, I thought it was some sort of structure that had somehow just appeared there. Perhaps I didn't see it before. But after staring at this silhouette, I could make out subtle movements, the kind of minute movements every living thing makes, even when trying to be motionless. And it was very clear it was alive and was trying very hard to stay still. It knew we were there. I'd never in my life seen a creature so large, shaped quite like that. My mind struggled to make sense of the shape. Perhaps it was just too dark to be sure. The only sure thought I had was not to move, not to utter a sound. Something deep within me knew that making ourselves known would be catastrophic. I heard my wife desperately quieten her breathing. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes passed in silence. Then movement. Extremely, terrifyingly recognizable movement. What appeared to be its head bent down a bit, and a limb to its left raised slightly as the creature nudged at itself. Having owned birds my entire life up until a year ago, I knew what I was looking at. A bird. A colossal, oddly shaped, senselessly huge bird, scratching at its breast, with an impossibly long and thin beak. The way it lifted its wing absolutely baffled me, because its wingspan would have been 30 or 35 feet. My heart rose in pace, each pounding beat sending a stinging sensation throughout my entire body. Was this true fear? The realization that death was very close, and even more real than I'd ever understood. Knowing so much as a bit too deep of a breath could result in being devoured by a creature larger than the awning we sat under. I wanted to shiver, but my mind denied me even that. No moving, it decreed. No sound whatsoever. The primal fear awakened inside of me was doing everything it could to keep me alive. When the headlights came on, I choked on air. My wife must have felt a different reaction to this creature. While I gazed on in horror, she had panicked and figured the only thing we could do was attempt to scare the beast. She had reached over and flicked on the headlights. The car was aimed close enough to the creature's location that the beams revealed nearly everything. A thick layer of dark, mangy fur all over its body, besides the wings. Beak nearly as long as my car. A creature so heavy and strong, its talons tore through the asphalt it stood upon. At the sight of our headlights, the creature was not afraid. It was angry. Wings spread out far and wide, it revealed its true size to us as the rain and lightning burst back into existence all around us. I could have sworn my wife and I both screamed in unison, but the sound of the returning chaos drowned out all other noise. With the twitch of my ankle, I practically buried the accelerator. The tires began to squeal as they struggled to find purchase on the gravel. They soon did, causing the car to lurch forward before taking off at breakneck speed. I aimed for the pavement, lopsidedly falling into and ramping out of the ditch. Daring not to look back, I drove ahead with almost no visibility towards the next patch of forest I could make out while I was parked under that awning. I knew it was in this direction, but with the full return of the downpour, I couldn't be sure how close I was, or if I was even on the road at this point. My wife screamed next to me. Thunder boomed. Rain pattered. And then a frequent, oddly heavy gust of wind grew closer by the second, the beating of gigantic wings belonging to a creature in pursuit of its prey. I felt my toes dig harder down into the floor, as if there was any more room for the accelerator to fall. The speedometer read 65, 75, 90 miles per hour. But it wasn't fast enough. A shrill avian call of similar magnitude to a collapsing skyscraper reverberated the car and my ribcage alike. It all came to an end when my car began to tumble and roll rapidly off the road. Down was up, left was right. It felt like my insides became my outsides, as everything then went black. When I came to, I was upside down. The upper half of my forehead sat submerged in water. Beth. I tried to call my wife's name. I'm sure it sounded like little more than a whispered mutter. It's gonna be all right. Sir, you've been in a wreck. Please don't move. I turned as far as I could. That wasn't much, as the sharp pain in my neck made me wince. There was a man in a reflective yellow coat knelt down in the remnants of a flood, speaking to me. From what I could see from my limited position, he appeared to be searching for some way to get me out. He must have been able to get me out of there, though, because the next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital with a broken arm, some broken ribs, and my unconscious wife lying in a bed next to me. Family gathered worriedly around us in an apparently overcrowded hospital. Maybe we weren't the only ones who suffered in the severe storm and flash floods. Or maybe it was the pandemic. I don't know. Luckily, I was going to be fine, said a very busy doctor. Yet, my wife was comatose. When I heard that, I remember breaking down. I remember crying. A pang of guilt rushed over me like a tidal wave. It was my fault. She was comatose because I panicked and tried to escape that behemoth of a bird. If I had remained calm, she'd be awake, I told myself. Weeks of physical therapy later, my wife at last awakened. I couldn't be happier. Upon her shoulder, I cried and begged for forgiveness for the harm I'd done. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said with some trouble. "I turned on those headlights. You just did what you had to do to get us to safety." The two of us recovered fully. For a long while, we didn't drive. Groceries we'd have delivered to the house. Several months later, we began driving on occasion during the day. Yet even to this day, we don't drive at night. And thunderstorms have us hiding in our bedroom with the doors and windows locked. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of heavy rhythmic gusts outside. Thankfully, I'm always met with either typical stormy skies or clear days, and no giant, angry birds. Nearly killed by a Pliosaur, from GeorgieH. This story takes place a few years ago when I was out fishing in Australia. I encountered something that should have been extinct over 65 million years ago. It was just like any other day here in Australia. Hot temperatures, clear skies, and perfect weather overall. I decided to go out fishing just for the practice. I wasn't really intending to catch and cook anything. Anything I caught, I would return back to the ocean. I must have been out there for a good few hours when suddenly something surfaced about maybe 70 yards away from my boat. I could not see much of what it was. All I could see was its head. I decided to go and have a look at it to see what it could be. It was too far for me to determine what it was. So I started up the engine and made my way over to it. As I got closer, the head began to take a more clear shape. From what I could tell, it reminded me of a saltwater crocodile. That was when I came to the conclusion that it was one. Saltwater crocodiles do come into the ocean from time to time, but this was the first time I'd seen one out here. As I got closer to the croc, it seemed a bit off from what a normal croc should look like. This animal seemed to have really smooth skin, as opposed to a croc which is covered in rough skin. As I got closer, I realized that this was no crocodile at all. No, this animal had really smooth gray skin covering its whole body. It had a crocodile-like head, but it definitely wasn't one. It had pointy, interlocking teeth, a large body with what looked to be 4 flippers instead of legs, and it had a small tail, with what appeared to be a fluke on the end of its tail. This animal looked like something straight out of the Jurassic World films. Unlike most people who would just assume what I was looking at would be a dinosaur, I knew that this was a marine reptile, a Pliosaurus of some kind. The creature had to be over 30 feet long. It was bigger than my boat, that's for sure. The Pliosaurus just kind of drifted on the water next to my boat, not moving or using its flippers. If anything, it seemed rather peaceful. I stared at it in amazement. I couldn't actually believe what I was seeing. I looked at the creature's head, and as soon as I did, its eyes looked directly back at me. It happened so quick. The Pliosaurus's head then shot upwards at me, jaws agape as it practically threw itself out of the water at me. I just about barely avoided the jaws. The Pliosaurus snapped its jaws together, and I saw it dive headfirst into the water. I was not staying there any longer. I started up the engine and my boat shot forward, away from the spot where I last saw the creature. I looked over my shoulder several times and I could see a black shadow following me under the surface. After about a minute of being chased, I could no longer see the shadow. I've been back to the same spot I saw the Pliosaurus several times, and I haven't seen it since. But I know that somewhere out there it's still gliding beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to strike. Pterodactyl in Lansing, Illinois, from Darrell A. I hate to sound like a nut. That's exactly what people are afraid of, but here goes. I saw a pterodactyl that was as big as a Piper Cub. Sometime around 1968 or 69 in a city of over 24,000 people in broad daylight, I saw it. I was 17 or 18 at the time, and it flew due west. I didn't have a soul around me to witness it. It was a summer day, I think around 1 p.m. I went out to my dad's car. Now, I can't remember if I was going somewhere or what I went to the car for, but I know the sky was very clear, only an occasional cloud, and the air seemed so still. Nothing made a sound. I could only faintly hear the little bit of traffic on the usually busy street just a block away. For some reason, something in the sky caught my eye. I turned to my left, and there, about 20 feet over the trees, was this thing coming. As it got closer, I recognized it as a pterodactyl. I stood in awe. I tried to get anyone around me to see it, but there was no one around, not even a car coming down our street at the time. As it got closer, I saw it had a large, pointed head with a crest on top. It had bat-like wings spanning about 20 feet. They flapped only once every couple of seconds. The membranes were a dark gray, and the limbs reddish-brown. It carried its back legs under and behind its body. I noticed the feet had claws, or talons. The body was a dull brown with fur instead of feathers, and it had a tail about 5 feet long with a spade at the end. During the 20 to 30 seconds I was able to view it, I was panicking for anyone I could get to see this with me, but there was just nobody. I thought to myself, am I nuts? Is this thing real? So I decided to yell at it when it got just behind me in the sky. I yelled as loud as I could, hoping someone else would hear me, or that this thing would react if it was real. "Hey!" I yelled out, and the thing turned its head, but in the opposite direction of where I was. I yelled again about 2 seconds later, and this time, it pinpointed me. Its mouth opened, and its bluish-gray eye picked me up. I was honestly scared. I thought of diving under the car, but then I thought, with those big teeth and that long bill, it could just grab me right out of there. The bill was about 4 feet long, and there was not an empty spot where teeth didn't show when it opened that mouth. As it looked at me, that mouth opened, and I didn't dare yell again. Its head was as the body, a dull light brown, and the crest was more reddish, a brighter red in the middle. The bill was more yellowish, and those teeth were white. It turned its head back straight and closed its mouth, then just continued on its way, due west as I watched in amazement and awe, wondering where it was going, where it had come from. I watched it until it was just a dot in the sky. Then I ran over to my neighbor's house and told my buddy who was in his upstairs bedroom. He had seen a UFO with me at one point, so I figured he might believe me. I realized only after reading the story that I'd read it before. The supposed creature in this story may not be technically a dinosaur, but it is still prehistoric. The smallest lake in my neighborhood has something huge and dangerous lurking inside. From SEB 32. I live in southern Florida, and in my neighborhood we have a variety of lakes. There are large lakes connected to other lakes, and some that are just one small canal, which do not connect into any other waterway. I've lived in my neighborhood, which I enjoy fishing in, for my whole life, and now I'm 15 as of writing this. Yeah, I know you're probably wondering that I shouldn't be fishing too much in those lakes, since it is South Florida. This is going to be important later. I fished in these lakes for about 7 years, once I really got into fishing. I would go to Bass Pro Shops, a place where you can get any type of bait and tackle for fishing. I'd recently gone before the virus pandemic to get some fresh chicken livers for some catfishing. The catfish we usually have are plecos, bullhead catfish, and channel catfish. The biggest ones we have in the lakes are the channel catfish, who can be about 3 feet long and 70 pounds. The day that changed my opinions on these lakes happened about a month before writing this. Fishing is pretty much the only thing you can do while being quarantined. That day I'd been fishing for about an hour in the separate lakes, which connected into others, when I decided to try my luck in the small lake that didn't connect into any others. I had no luck with the others anyway, so I went over there. This lake is probably 150 feet across and about 30 feet wide, so you can get a good idea of how small it is. It was gradually getting darker by then. It was about 5 o'clock. I cast my line into the water a good 20 feet away, and I waited for it to sink to the bottom. After all, catfish are bottom feeders. After waiting about 5 minutes and playing on my phone, I felt a sharp tug. I waited, then set the hook. Within a few seconds, I saw a small bullhead catfish about a foot long, squirming in the water. As I was getting the fish to the bank, something I did not see tugged on my line, but with such force that the rod nearly broke, even it being a rod that could handle 100 pounds. My line snapped, and I fell backwards hard. The catfish was gone, and so was the rest of my line. What could have done that? A catfish that big? I'd seen big catfish in this lake, but not one that could break my line that easily. As I said before, you had to be aware of alligators in South Florida, but all the alligators had been exterminated and removed from all the possible lakes in this neighborhood. Well, unless the people had missed some, which I doubted, because when all of them had been removed, the people had captured about 50 of them, and that's a lot of gators, I can tell ya. Snakehead fish, an invasive species that had been eating the fish in our lakes for a couple of years, couldn't have been responsible either, since my line was graded and could withstand teeth, and no snakehead can outmuscle 100 pounds of breaking strength. I had no hooks on me, and besides it was getting dark, so I decided to wrap it up and go home. I could use some more chicken liver for tomorrow anyway. I'd get up early and come out again. Still, I kept wondering what it could be. As I got up the next morning at around 8, I was ready to go again. I would start at the same lake where I'd nearly caught the other catfish. I positioned myself a good distance away from the bank, thinking that indeed it was an alligator that had taken my catfish the night before, so it would be a good idea to stay away from the edge. As I cast the line, I happened to look to my left, and to my surprise, I saw a dead bullseye snakehead, the invasive fish I mentioned, cut in half. I didn't know what predator could have done that to a snakehead, and the thoughts of an alligator filled my mind again. As I left my line for a second, I headed over to the fish. It was clearly split in half, its guts protruding. I could see the visible teeth marks on it, and they were big teeth, as I could tell. Even if it was an alligator, it wouldn't have left the fish here. It would have eaten it without a moment's hesitation. Suddenly, my neighbor, Mr. Tom, stepped up to me.
"Hey, son, I saw that fish last night. It just washed up on the bank, and along came the rest of it a couple seconds later."
I said, "Do you think it could have been a gator?" Mr. Tom shook his head.
"No alligator would have done that. I haven't seen one since they took them all out. Besides, they would have come up and sunned themselves after all, and I haven't seen that at all. Must be another fish."
It was true. An alligator or crocodile would have to come up to sun themselves every once in a while. Something strange was going on in this lake. I thanked Mr. Tom, and he went back into his house. I continued fishing for a while. Then I felt another hard tug. I reeled in a smaller blue catfish after about a minute. To my shock, as I was taking the hook out of the fish's mouth, I happened to glance over at the water, and what I saw made me jump back. I could see a shadow about 5 feet from the bank, just sitting there. Yes, there are plants and tall weeds in the water, but no weeds could have been this shape. Plus the water is very clean, so it wasn't just a pile of litter. This shadow was huge. I swear on my life the front of it looked like an oval with a flat head. This shadow had to be at least 25 feet long, and this lake could get 40 feet deep. You can think I'm crazy, but I'm not kidding. This thing seemed to have fins on the side, like sharks do, but these fins were bigger and wider than a shark's. I could not see much else, as I desperately tried to look for a tail of some sort. Then I watched it slowly seem to sink. When the last of the shadow was gone, I looked at the catfish. By then, it was almost dead, feebly flopping around. I realized I'd been staring at that shadow for a while. I quickly threw the catfish back in the water. As I quickly packed up my stuff and prepared to leave, thinking I probably would never come back to this lake, I heard a splash. I whipped my head around and saw a giant head, sort of grayish in color, juggling the catfish I'd just caught in its jaws. At least, I think it was the same catfish. These jaws were full of razor-sharp teeth, at least 4 inches in length. Suddenly, the head dipped back into the water, along with the catfish. I was in disbelief, horrified of what I'd just seen. The head was definitely not a shark's or alligator's, and when I later researched this thing to see what it could have been, I discovered the Dunkleosteus, a prehistoric sea monster. I couldn't see the tail of the creature in the lake, so I couldn't match its tail or body with this prehistoric monster, so it may have been something else. The teeth were different, not bony and looking like a guillotine, like the teeth of the Dunkleosteus. The creature in the lake had razor-sharp teeth in about 2 rows, if I correctly saw it. This monster was also about 20 to 25 feet in length, as the prehistoric Dunkleosteus was about 30 feet, so I don't know what the heck this thing was. But I've stopped fishing in that lake as well. My questions are, could it have been a Dunkleosteus? How can it be since it has been extinct for millions of years? And what the heck is it doing in a freshwater lake that's not even as big as a regular-sized canal? Could there be a passageway? And how can it not have been seen by anyone else but me? There are so many answers I would like to know. I don't even know what something like that would do to me, especially being able to rip apart catfish and the toothy snakeheads. Just in case when I fish in the other lakes, I don't go anywhere near the bank. And I never so much as put my finger in the water to release fish, as I just throw them back, a good distance away from the edge. I'm not making this up. Call me crazy, think whatever, but all I'm saying is there is something in the smallest lake in my neighborhood, lurking beneath the shallows, and it's not a crocodile. I saw a dinosaur at Christmas. From Arsenal R. 15th. It was Christmas Eve night. My family and I were watching The Polar Express, as we usually did every year. When the film ended and the credits began to roll, my mom asked me to go and blow out the candles on the windowsill. I did as she asked. I blew out the candles and I reached up to close the blinds. But just before I could close them, I stopped and just stared at what I saw. Outside in the front garden, rolling around in the snow, were 4 animals that were no bigger than a house cat. They were covered in white feathers except for their faces, hands, and feet. They had slender snouts, 3 clawed fingers, and 3 clawed toes, except one toe was curled to look like a sickle claw that are seen in raptors. Their skin was gray in color, but I couldn't see their eyes. They playfully snapped their jaws at each other and tackled each other to the ground. I didn't know what to say or do. I just stared at them in wonderment. Was I actually seeing dinosaurs? I was so focused on these creatures I didn't notice that my dad was speaking to me. All I heard was, "Hey, what are you looking at?" from my dad. I didn't take my eyes off of these creatures. I whispered to him, "You need to see this." My dad got up from the couch and walked over to me. I pointed out the window and he looked in that direction. I watched his face as his eyes widened at the sight. "Are those what I think they are?" I nodded in agreement. Just then, my mom walked over to us, asking us what we were looking at. My dad turned his head, facing her, and putting a finger to his lips. He made a hand gesture for her to come over. My mom walked over to the window, and she gasped at what she saw. We were all awestruck. We couldn't believe it. Real dinosaurs. Millions of years of supposedly being extinct, and yet here they were in our front garden. I couldn't help but smile at what I was seeing, until I heard my dad gasp. "What is it?" I asked. He pointed to the right, and I saw what he saw. Emerging from the forest was what I could only assume to be the mother. It must have stood about 1.8 to 2 meters tall and about 5 to 7 meters in length, and it possessed the same features as the babies: white feathers and skin exposed on the head, feet, and hands. It walked out of the forest and into our front garden where the little ones were. The baby raptors cocked their heads as their mother approached them. The mother raptor then lowered her head and nuzzled at the babies. This was truly an amazing sight to see. Just showed that even some of the scariest creatures in nature are also caring parents. We all watched in amazement as the mother raptor raised her head and began to walk forward, with her babies following behind her. The mother raptor then walked in front of our porch. Then the porch light lit up our front garden. The mother stopped in her tracks and looked in the direction of the porch light. She seemed to snarl at it, revealing razor-sharp teeth. Then the amazement of the raptors turned into terror as the mother raptor looked in our direction. Unable to move, we all just stood there frozen in terror at the sight. The mother raptor hissed at us before turning her direction towards the woods, running off, with her babies following after. I sat in bed that night, unable to sleep from the experience. I mean, how could anyone sleep after seeing real dinosaurs alive? It must have been 2:45 a.m. Christmas Day, when I swear I could hear the sound of snow crunching outside. Someone or something was moving around out there. Quietly, I moved over to my window and looked out at the front garden, and I saw her again, the mother raptor. She was in the front garden again, but this time her babies were not with her. She had returned on her own. The large raptor walked over to the window my parents and I had been at before and peered inside. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight to get a better look. That was a big mistake. It caught her attention. She was now looking up at my window. Quickly, I pulled away from the window and I ran to the corner of my room. My heart was beating out of my chest. I nearly had a heart attack when I heard the scraping sound outside the house. I think it was trying to climb up. I could hardly breathe when I saw its silhouette lit by the moon as the raptor reached my window. I heard a snarl and claws scratching across my window. Unable to withstand the pressure, the glass burst, shattering all over the floor of my bedroom. The creature pulled the upper part of its body into my room, letting out an ear-piercing roar. I screamed in response. Then my door swung open. My dad stood there with a pistol in hand. He aimed and fired at the creature several times. The beast snarled again before yanking itself backwards out the window, landing with a thud in the snow before darting off into the woods. It's been a few years since this happened to me. I still live in that house with my parents, and I always wonder when Christmas comes around if maybe I'll see those raptors again, because every so often I swear I can hear roaring and snarling coming from that forest.